Standing in the shadow of a medieval cathedral, you can't help but feel small, not just because of its staggering height, but because of the sheer weight of time it represents. These stone giants didn't rise in a decade or even a lifetime. Some took 300 years or more to complete, with generations of workers living and dying without ever seeing the finished masterpiece. What could possibly drive people to pour centuries of labor, wealth, and faith into a single building? The answer lies in something far grander than architecture. Cathedrals were the beating heart of medieval society, monuments to divine glory, yes, but also to human ambition, ingenuity, and the unshakable belief that something extraordinary was worth sacrificing for. Think about the sheer audacity of it. In an era without cranes, computers, or even basic machinery, communities rallied around a vision so vast it would outlast kingdoms. Every block of stone was hauled by hand, every stained glass window crafted with painstaking precision, and every sculpture chiseled with stories meant to echo through the ages. But cathedrals weren't just feats of engineering, they were living symbols. They told the story of a town's devotion, its wealth, its place in the world. To build one was to declare, we are part of something eternal, and that's why the work never stopped, even when wars raged, plagues struck, or money ran dry. The cathedral was always there, rising slowly, a testament to perseverance. Today, we're going to unravel the secrets behind these timeless wonders. How did medieval builders achieve the impossible with nothing but rudimentary tools and sheer determination? What hidden meanings are encoded in their arches, their gargoyles, their labyrinthine floors? And why, after all these centuries, do these structures still take our breath away? This isn't just a story about bricks and mortar. It's about the human spirit, the drive to create, to connect with the divine, and to leave a mark that outshines the ages. By the time we're done, you'll walk away with a newfound appreciation for these stone giants and the generations who dared to dream them into existence. To understand why cathedral construction exploded across medieval Europe, we have to step back into the 11th century, when the church wasn't just a spiritual authority, it was the backbone of society. Imagine a world without skyscrapers, stadiums, or even universities. The grandest structures in any town were its churches, and the mightiest of all would be the cathedral. But this wasn't just about size, it was a statement. Bishops and wealthy patrons poured fortunes into these projects because they believed a cathedral could do more than house worshippers. It could inspire awe, reinforce faith, and even shape the destiny of a city. Take the story of Chartres Cathedral in France. When fire destroyed its predecessor in the year 1194, the townspeople didn't just rebuild, they dreamed bigger. They envisioned towering spires, vast stained glass windows, and a labyrinth in the floor meant to symbolize the long, winding path to salvation. This wasn't just construction, it was a spiritual arms race. Cities competed to outdo one another, believing that a more magnificent cathedral would attract pilgrims, wealth, and divine favor. And the church encouraged it, seeing these stone monuments as a way to unite fragmented kingdoms under a shared faith. But ambition came at a cost. Unlike modern projects with blueprints and budgets, medieval cathedrals were often designed as they were built, with each master mason adding his own innovations. Materials had to be hauled from quarries miles away, sometimes by oxcart or barge. Workers risked their lives scaling scaffolding made of rope and wood, and funding could vanish overnight if a patron died or a war drained the treasury. Yet through famine, plague, and political upheaval, the work continued. Why? Because a cathedral wasn't just a building, it was a covenant between a community and the divine. a promise written in stone that faith could move mountains one block at a time. Gothic architecture didn't just change how cathedrals looked, it transformed how they felt. Step inside one of these soaring spaces, and you're immediately struck by the way light filters through stained glass, painting the stone floors in kaleidoscopic colors. This was no accident. The pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses that define Gothic design weren't merely engineering solutions, they were tools to create an experience. Builders wanted worshippers to feel like they were stepping into heaven itself, surrounded by light and height that defied earthly limitations. Take the ribbed vault, for example. Earlier Romanesque cathedrals relied on thick walls and rounded arches, which meant small windows and dim interiors. But Gothic architects realized that by redistributing weight through a skeleton of stone ribs, they could replace solid walls with vast panels of stained glass. Suddenly, biblical stories could be told not just through carvings or sermons, but through sunlight streaming in vibrant blues, reds, and golds. At Chartres, the windows alone contain over 26,000 square feet of glass, a literal illuminated manuscript in stone and light. Then there were the flying buttresses, those graceful stone arms stretching out from the walls. To medieval eyes, they might have seemed like divine intervention. How else could a building so delicate stand so tall? By transferring the weight of the roof outward, these supports allowed cathedrals to reach dizzying heights. The nave of Amiens Cathedral, for instance, towers over 140 feet, a feat that would have been unthinkable just a century earlier. But this innovation came at a cost. Each new technique required trial and error, and many early Gothic experiments ended in collapse. The original choir at Beauvais Cathedral, which soared to a record-breaking 157 feet, came crashing down 12 years after completion, a stark reminder that ambition often outpaced the technology of the time. Yet the risks were worth taking. For the church, these cathedrals were more than buildings, they were sermons in stone. The verticality of Gothic design pointed heavenward, urging eyes and souls upward. The labyrinthine floor patterns mirrored life's spiritual journey, while gargoyles perched like reminders of sin lurking at the edges of holiness. Every element served a dual purpose, structural and symbolic. And that's why construction dragged on for generations. Perfecting this harmony of form and faith couldn't be rushed. It took centuries of chiseling, lifting, and revising to turn these visions into reality, one soaring spire at a time. Building a cathedral wasn't just an architectural challenge. It was a financial tightrope walk across centuries. Imagine trying to fund a project so vast that even modern billionaires would hesitate. The cost of a single cathedral could bankrupt entire towns, yet medieval communities found ways to keep the work alive through sheer collective will. Money didn't flow in steady streams. It came in fits and starts, donations from nobles hoping to secure their place in heaven, pennies scraped together by peasants, even the sale of indulgences promising shorter time in purgatory. Every stained glass window, every carved saint, every ton of limestone represented someone's hope, guilt, or ambition translated into coin. Take the story of Strasbourg Cathedral, where construction halted for over 50 years because the city simply ran out of funds. The half-finished tower stood as a silent plea for more generosity, a physical reminder that divine glory couldn't be rushed. When work finally resumed, it wasn't because some king opened his treasury. It was because the townspeople organized pilgrimages, selling relics and miracles to draw crowds whose donations would fund the next phase. This wasn't just fundraising, it was communal alchemy turning faith into stone, but the system was fragile. A single bad harvest or outbreak of disease could dry up donations overnight. Skilled masons wouldn't work for promises, and imported materials like Baltic timber or Italian marble demanded hard currency. Some bishops got creative, offering donors their names carved into the very fabric of the building or commissioning portraits in stained glass, medieval versions of donor plaques in modern museums. At Lincoln Cathedral, records show wealthy families sponsoring specific pillars, their wealth quite literally holding up the roof. Yet for all the ingenuity, delays were inevitable. The great Cathedral of Cologne languished unfinished for 300 years, its crane left rusting in place as a symbol of stalled dreams. These gaps in construction weren't failures. They were proof of the staggering resilience required to keep the vision alive across generations. Workers who'd never see completion still poured their skills into the project, trusting that their grandchildren's grandchildren would finish what they started. That's the real miracle of these buildings, not just how they defied gravity, but how they defied human impatience, binding communities together in a shared pursuit of something greater than themselves. Behind every towering cathedral wall stood an army of nameless artisan stonemasons who could read rock like a book, carpenters shaping oak into ribs for vaulted ceilings, glassmakers melting sand and metal into radiant holy scenes. These weren't laborers clocking in and out. They were keepers of secrets, part of guilds that guarded techniques closer than gold. A master mason might spend a lifetime perfecting the curve of a single arch, knowing his signature, often literally carved into the stone, would outlive him by centuries. And because these skills were so rare, cathedrals became living classrooms. Apprentice boys as young as 12 would mix mortar, fetch tools, and watch silently for years before being trusted to carve so much as a leaf on a capital. Consider the stained glass masters of Chartres, who transformed crushed gems and cobalt into windows that glowed like jewels. Each pane was a puzzle glass cut thick here to deepen the blue, thin there to let in more light, all held together by lead strips bent just so. The craftsmen knew their colors would fade over time, so they arranged them deliberately, reds for martyrdom, blues for divinity, greens for renewal. Even the placement told a story. Windows near the altar shimmered with scenes of salvation, while those by the entrance showed the wages of sin, guiding worshippers literally from darkness into light. Then there were the stone carvers turning blocks into Bibles. Gargoyles weren't just rainspouts, they were morality plays in grotesque form. A grinning demon here as a warning, a pious saint there as hope. Look closely at the foliage in Canterbury Cathedral, and you'll find stone ivy with tiny snails clinging to the leaves, a hidden nod to patience and slow growth. These touches weren't commissioned by bishops, they sprang from the artisans themselves, leaving whispers of their worldview in the margins. But this reverence for craft came at a pace we'd find unbearable today. Raising a single pillar could take a year. Fitting a stained glass window might occupy a team for months, and when winter came, work often stopped entirely. Mortar wouldn't set in the cold, and frozen fingers couldn't carve. Yet the slowness was the point. In an age before factories, perfection couldn't be rushed. Each chisel strike was a prayer, each pane of glass a testament to the belief that beauty was worth time. That's why so many craftsmen willingly spent their lives on projects they'd never see finished. They weren't just building a cathedral, they were adding their verse to an epic poem in stone, trusting that those who came after would carry the story forward. Imagine hoisting a 2-ton block of limestone hundreds of feet into the air using nothing but ropes, wooden beams, and muscle power. That was the daily reality for medieval builders who turned physics puzzles into stone symphonies. Their cranes weren't steel giants but wooden skeletons powered by human or animal labor, treadwheels where workers walked like hamsters to rotate the mechanism, inch by painstaking inch. At Wells Cathedral, records show teams lifting stones at a rate of just 1 per day, a pace that would bankrupt a modern contractor. Yet this slowness hid brilliance. Master masons used geometry so precise, their chalk diagrams on tracing floors, large rooms where full-scale plans were drawn, could guide cuts accurate to within a fraction of an inch. The real marvel wasn't just lifting stones but shaping them. Without power tools, every curve and angle had to be carved by hand using chisels and mallets. Masons developed a secret language of marks, unique symbols etched into each block so workers knew exactly where it fit in the puzzle. At York Minster, you can still spot these hidden signatures centuries later. And when it came to vaulted ceilings, the challenge multiplied. Ribs had to intersect perfectly overhead, which meant calculating angles without computers. Builders used ropes knotted at precise intervals to measure arcs, creating what were essentially medieval protractors. But for all their ingenuity, disaster was always one misstep away. The original crossing tower at Ely Cathedral collapsed in the 1300s, likely because the foundation couldn't handle the weight. Rebuilding it required inventing an octagonal lantern structure so revolutionary, it's still studied by engineers today. Similarly, when Beauvais Cathedral's choir vaults crashed down twice, first in 1284, then again in 1573, builders didn't abandon the project. They analyzed the rubble, adapted their techniques, and pushed higher. What's astonishing isn't just that they overcame these hurdles, but how they turned limitations into art. Those flying buttresses everyone admires, they weren't just decorative, they were emergency fixes, added when walls started cracking under strain. The intricate fan vaulting at Gloucester Abbey. Born from a need to distribute weight more efficiently after earlier designs failed, every so-called flaw became a chance to innovate, proving that necessity wasn't just the mother of invention, it was the architect of the sublime. War didn't just shape kingdoms, it reshaped the very stones of cathedrals. When armies clashed outside city walls, these sacred buildings often found themselves on the front lines, their fate tied to the rise and fall of dynasties. Take Rheims Cathedral, where French kings were crowned for centuries. During the 100 Years' War, English forces deliberately targeted its facade, smashing statues of monarchs they saw as rivals. The damage was so severe that reconstruction dragged on for nearly 200 years, with craftsmen painstakingly replacing each shattered saint and angel. But the interruptions went deeper than vandalism. When conflict erupted, the same ox carts meant to haul limestone blocks were commandeered to transport siege engines. Masons traded chisels for swords, and church funds meant for stained glass were funneled into ransom payments or fortifications. Some cathedrals became literal casualties of war. The original roof of Coventry Cathedral burned to ashes during World War II bombings, leaving only its skeletal walls standing, a haunting reminder of how quickly centuries of work could vanish. In Spain, the Cathedral of León endured repeated attacks during the Reconquista. Its construction halted each time Muslim forces advanced. Workers would return years later to find their half-finished arches crumbling, forcing them to start anew. Even when buildings survived intact, the economic aftermath of war could stall progress for generations. After the Black Death and peasant revolts of the 14th century, many towns simply lacked the manpower or money to continue. The South Tower of Strasbourg Cathedral stood unfinished for over 4 centuries, its jagged silhouette a silent testament to emptied coffers and broken supply chains. Yet in a twist of irony, conflict sometimes spurred innovation. When Canterbury Cathedral's choir burned in 1174, the disaster allowed architects to experiment with the very first Gothic elements in England, transforming tragedy into a stylistic revolution. Similarly, the repeated sieges of Chartres forced builders to reinforce its structure, leading to the pioneering use of flying buttresses that would define Gothic architecture. These adaptations reveal a profound truth. Cathedrals weren't static monuments, but living records of resilience. Every patched wall, every altered blueprint tells a story of communities refusing to let war erase their dreams. The most poignant evidence lies in the stones themselves. At Exeter Cathedral, careful observers can spot where Norman-era masonry gives way to later Gothic styles, not because of artistic choice, but because Viking raids forced builders to pause for 60 years. When work resumed, architectural tastes had shifted, creating a visible timeline of interruption. Similarly, the nave of Vienna's Stephansdom shows three distinct colors of stone: white from pre-war quarries, reddish from post-war replacements, and blackened sections where fire damage was left unrepaired as a memorial. These inconsistencies weren't flaws, but badges of survival, proof that even when history tried to halt these projects, human determination kept them breathing across the centuries. The soaring walls of medieval cathedrals may have pointed toward heaven, but their foundations were firmly planted in the messy terrain of earthly power struggles. Behind every delayed archway or abandoned spire often lay a bitter tug of war between bishops hungry for prestige, kings eager to assert dominance, and popes determined to keep both in check. Take the dramatic case of Canterbury Cathedral, where Archbishop Thomas Becket's murder in 1170 turned the building into both a shrine and a political battleground. When King Henry II, who had famously clashed with Becket, was forced to fund expansions as penance, the craftsmen worked under the shadow of that unresolved tension, their chisels shaping stone and symbolism alike. Funding disputes could freeze construction for decades. In Milan, the Visconti family's feud with the local archbishop left the cathedral's facade unfinished for 300 years, as each side refused to contribute unless their coat of arms took precedence. Similar standoffs played out across Europe, where noble patrons would suddenly withdraw support if their preferred saint wasn't given a prominent statue, or if a bishop dared to claim credit for their donations. The Cathedral of Siena still bears the scars of such rivalries. Its impossibly ambitious plan to build the largest nave in Christendom abandoned mid-construction when the Black Death emptied coffers and exposed the vanity behind the project. Design choices became political statements. When the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV commissioned Prague's St. Vitus Cathedral, he insisted on French Gothic styles to align himself with Europe's cultural elite, snubbing local Bohemian traditions. The message was clear: cathedrals were press releases in stone, announcing alliances and ambitions to rivals near and far. Even the orientation of a building could spark conflict. In Lincoln, when the bishop ordered the altar moved to face east against the wishes of local guilds who had funded that section, work stopped for 11 years until a papal mediator brokered a compromise. Perhaps no conflict was more revealing than the battle over Rheims Cathedral during the Avignon papacy, when 7 successive popes wrestled with French monarchs for control of the coronation site. Each time power shifted, sculptures were added or destroyed, windows replaced, and inscriptions altered to reflect the new order. The building itself became a parchment, endlessly scraped clean and rewritten by whoever held the pen of authority. What emerged from these struggles wasn't just delayed construction timelines, but a profound truth. Every cathedral was a frozen moment in a never-ending negotiation between the divine and the temporal, where even the holiest spaces couldn't escape the fingerprints of human ambition. The moment you step inside a Gothic cathedral, your eyes are drawn irresistibly upward, not by accident but by design. Those ribbed vaults climbing toward the heavens, those slender pillars stretching like fingers toward the light, were medieval Europe's answer to an existential question: how do you bridge the gap between earth and the divine? Builders didn't just want structures that reached impressive heights, They crafted spaces that made you feel the weight of the sacred pressing down from above. At Amiens Cathedral, the nave rises 140 feet, equivalent to stacking 10 grown men head to toe. Yet the effect isn't intimidation, but invitation. The architecture whispers, look beyond what you can touch. This obsession with verticality wasn't just about aesthetics. It mirrored the medieval worldview, where the universe was seen as a great chain of being, from worms in the soil to angels in the highest spheres. Cathedrals became physical manifestations of that hierarchy. The lowest levels, with their sturdy columns and shadowy corners, represented the earthly realm. As your gaze traveled upward past the triforium to the clerestory windows, you were symbolically ascending through celestial layers. Even the materials told this story. The foundation stones were rough-hewn local limestone, while the spires might be topped with imported lead or gilded bronze, quite literally elevating common earth toward heavenly gold. The spiritual mathematics behind these proportions reveal even deeper intentions. Many Gothic cathedrals were built using ratios believed to reflect divine harmony, the same proportions found in musical intervals or the human body, thought to mirror God's perfect creation. At Chartres, the width of the nave relates to its height in a 1:3 ratio, echoing the Trinity. These weren't arbitrary choices, they were sacred geometry made visible, turning architecture into a form of prayer. When a 12-year-old apprentice mixed mortar, he wasn't just bonding stones, he was participating in a cosmic blueprint. But this vertical ambition came with earthly consequences. The higher builders pushed, the more they flirted with disaster. Salisbury Cathedral's spire, added a century after the main structure was complete, leans precariously due to inadequate foundations. A visible reminder that reaching for heaven often meant tempting gravity. Some theologians even warned against excessive pride in these projects, fearing communities might confuse architectural achievement with spiritual superiority. Yet the drive to build upward persisted, less about arrogance than about a profound longing. In a world where most lives were spent bent over plows or looms, cathedrals offered a rare chance to stand tall, to feel, if only for the duration of a mass, that the gap between mortal and divine wasn't so wide after all. The true genius lies in how this symbolism worked on multiple levels. For the illiterate majority, the sheer physicality of the space taught theology more powerfully than any sermon. A peasant entering Cologne Cathedral didn't need to read Latin to understand his smallness before God. The architecture delivered that lesson viscerally. Meanwhile, educated clergy could decode the deeper layers, the 12 columns supporting the choir representing apostles, the 7 steps to the altar echoing the days of creation. Every inch of height carried meaning, turning stone into scripture. That's why interruptions in construction, when half-built walls stood open to the sky, were seen as spiritual crises. An unfinished cathedral wasn't just an eyesore, it was a broken ladder between earth and heaven, a promise of connection left unfulfilled. Even the setbacks reinforced the metaphor. When Beauvais's vaults collapsed twice, it wasn't interpreted as engineering failure, but as divine correction, a reminder that reaching too high required humility. The repaired sections incorporated more modest curves, as if the building itself had learned reverence. This interplay between aspiration and limitation became the cathedral's most enduring lesson. That transcendence isn't found in unbridled ambition, but in the tension between reaching and restraint. 7 centuries later, when steel skyscrapers dwarf these stone marvels, none stir the soul quite like a Gothic nave, because their height was never just about measurement. It was about meaning. A stone and glass hymn to humanity's eternal upward gaze. Imagine standing in Chartres Cathedral at noon, when sunlight pierces through its famous blue-stained glass, a color so vivid, medieval artisans supposedly crushed sapphires into the mix. The floor swims with pools of cobalt and ruby, transforming stone into something weightless, as if the very air has been sanctified. This wasn't mere decoration, it was alchemy. Gothic architects weaponized light itself, turning physics into theology. Where Romanesque churches had small windows that kept interiors dim and solemn, Gothic builders ripped open the walls, replacing stone with glass because they understood something profound. Light wasn't just a symbol of the divine, it was divinity made visible. The secret lay in the glassmaker's craft. Each pane was a mosaic of fragments held together by lead strips, but the real magic happened at the molecular level. Metallic oxides, cobalt for blue, gold for red, copper for green, were melted into the glass, creating colors that seemed to glow from within. At Bourges Cathedral, the windows depicting the Last Judgment use a gradient of red to black as you move downward, visually reinforcing the concept of heavenly ascent. And because most worshippers couldn't read Latin, these windows served as a comic book of scripture. The Poor Man's Bible at Canterbury tells entire gospel stories through sequential panels, from the Annunciation to the Crucifixion, with sunlight animating the narrative as the day progressed. But the true genius was in the scheduling. Architects oriented windows to exploit the sun's path. East-facing apse windows blazed at dawn during Mass, symbolizing resurrection, while west-facing rose windows caught the dying light of evening, a reminder of Judgment Day. Some, like the mystical Blue Virgin window at Chartres, appear to change hue depending on the weather, as if the Virgin Mary herself were responding to the prayers of pilgrims. Even the glass imperfections became part of the message. Air bubbles trapped in medieval glass scatter light unpredictably, creating the effect of stars twinkling against a colored sky, a deliberate echo of the firmament described in Genesis. This interplay of light and faith reached its peak in the rose windows, those massive circular masterpieces that crowned cathedral facades. Their radiating tracery wasn't just structural, it mirrored medieval diagrams of the universe, with God at the center and creation spiraling outward. When sunlight hits the north rose at Notre Dame de Paris, the shadows cast onto the floor below trace a perfect six-pointed star, a geometric proof of divine order hidden in plain sight. Builders knew these effects wouldn't be constant. They designed for specific moments, equinoxes when light would align with particular scenes, or feast days when certain saints' images would ignite in noontime brilliance. What's astonishing is how these techniques still work centuries later. Modern visitors, whether devout or secular, report feeling what medieval worshippers described, a sense of being bathed in something beyond the material. Scientists now attribute this to the way colored light affects brain chemistry, but Gothic architects didn't need neurology to understand the impact. They knew that by turning sunlight into stained glass sermons, they could make the intangible tangible. A peasant who'd never heard of Plato's allegory of the cave instinctively understood truth and beauty when standing beneath the windows of Saint Chapelle, where 15 towering panels dissolve the walls into a jeweled reliquary of light. In an age before electric bulbs, these cathedrals didn't just house the sacred, they became machines for generating wonder, using the oldest medium in creation, daylight itself, harnessed and sanctified one pane at a time. Pilgrims didn't just visit cathedrals, they built them one footstep at a time. Across medieval Europe, these sacred spaces rose along pilgrimage routes like spiritual way stations, their grandeur directly tied to the flow of faithful travelers. Take the Camino de Santiago, where towns vied to construct ever more impressive churches to lure pilgrims weary from months of walking. A cathedral wasn't just a place of worship, it was a destination, a spectacle promising miracles, indulgences, and just as importantly, a dry place to sleep after weeks on muddy roads. Relics were the original tourist attractions. Chartres claimed the Virgin Mary's tunic, Cologne housed the bones of the three kings, and Santiago de Compostela built an entire cathedral around the supposed remains of St. James. These sacred objects weren't merely displayed, they were marketed. Church officials staged elaborate unveilings during feast days, when relics would be paraded through streets draped in silk and gold. Pilgrims paid to touch or even kiss them, with the wealthiest donors earning front-row access. The economic impact was staggering. Records from Canterbury show relic tourism generated enough income in a single year to fund 3 new stained glass windows. While the shrine of Thomas Beckett became so lucrative, Henry VIII later looted it to finance his wars. But cathedrals didn't just cater to pilgrims, they were designed around their movements. Ambulatories, those curved walkways behind the altar, allowed endless streams of visitors to circle relics without disrupting Mass. At St. Denis in Paris, cleverly placed side chapels created a spiritual conveyor belt where pilgrims could pray at multiple shrines in one continuous flow. Even the floors served a purpose, where patterns in stone labyrinths like the one at Chartres suggest pilgrims traverse them on their knees as penance, their physical struggle mirroring the arduous journey that brought them there. The social energy was palpable. Imagine the cacophony of a cathedral at peak pilgrimage season, vendors hawking badges, medieval souvenirs, guides shouting over crowds in a dozen languages, the scent of sweat and candle wax mingling with incense. These weren't hushed sanctuaries, but vibrant crossroads where news, gossip, and innovation spread as fast as prayers. A Flemish merchant might trade wool techniques with an Italian banker near the baptismal font, while a wandering scholar translated Arabic medical texts by the cloister. This constant influx of outsiders forced architectural innovations. Wide naves accommodated processions, towering porches provided shelter for those waiting overnight to enter. At Santiago de Compostela, a hidden gallery above the main doors let choir boys serenade arriving pilgrims without blocking traffic, a medieval version of mood lighting. Even the art served double duty. The famously exaggerated column statues at Moissac weren't just decorative. Their elongated proportions made them visible from the back of packed crowds, turning theology into theater. The legacy lingers today. Modern visitors tracing the Camino still pause at Laon Cathedral's stained glass windows, just as 12th century travelers did. But what few realize is that their footsteps echo an ancient economic engine, one where faith and commerce spun together like the gears of a great clock, each pilgrimage season winding the mechanism that kept these stone giants growing century after century. Gargoyles weren't just rainspouts, they were medieval morality plays carved in stone. Perched high above bustling town squares, these grotesque figures served as silent preachers, their twisted faces and contorted bodies warning against vice. At Notre Dame, a particularly chilling gargoyle depicts a man being devoured by demons, his stone face frozen in eternal torment, a stark reminder of the fate awaiting the unrepentant. But these weren't just generic monsters. Local craftsmen often infused them with inside jokes or contemporary references. The famous chewing gum gargoyle at Washington National Cathedral, carved in the 1990s, winks at modern life while honoring the medieval tradition of blending the familiar with the divine. Step closer to the walls and you'll find another layer of storytelling, the humble corbel. These supporting stones beneath roof lines became canvases for everyday humanity. At Lincoln Cathedral, one shows a baker caught mid-yawn, another a musician tuning his lute. Far from frivolous, these carvings celebrated ordinary vocations as sacred callings, reminding worshippers that holiness wasn't confined to the altar. Some carried sharper messages. A miser clutching his money bag at Exeter Cathedral served as a not-so-subtle rebuke to wealthy parishioners skimping on donations. Then there were the capitals, those intricately carved tops of columns where foliage could sprout into Bible scenes overnight. The green man motif, with leaves bursting from a human face, appears unexpectedly across Europe, blending pagan rebirth symbolism with Christian resurrection themes. At Clermont-Ferrand, an entire calendar unfolds across capitals, showing peasants sowing and harvesting in tune with liturgical seasons, weaving agricultural life into sacred time. But the most provocative messages often hid in plain sight. The labyrinth embedded in Chartres Cathedral's floor, a spiraling path nearly 1,000 feet long, wasn't just decorative. Pilgrims would traverse it on their knees as a miniature pilgrimage, the physical struggle mirroring life's winding path to salvation. Meanwhile, hidden among the saints and angels, you might spot a fox preaching to geese a dig at corrupt clergy, or a mermaid holding a mirror vanity's warning. Even the building materials spoke volumes. The alternating light and dark stones in Gloucester Cathedral's cloisters represented the eternal struggle between good and evil, a theological lesson built into every archway. Perhaps the most poignant symbols were the unintended ones, whether worn statues missing hands or noses became accidental metaphors for the passage of time, while centuries of candles soot darkening once vibrant paintings whispered about faith's enduring mark. These cathedrals didn't just contain symbols, they became living allegories, their stones absorbing new meanings with each generation that passed beneath their vaults. What began as lessons for the illiterate transformed into a universal language where even the cracks told stories of resilience. When we picture medieval cathedrals rising stone by stone, it's easy to fixate on the architects and master masons, but the truth is, these monuments were built by entire communities with calloused hands and stubborn hope. Imagine a farmer leaving his fields during harvest to haul stones for a month, not because he was paid, but because the bishop declared it his Christian duty. Or a widow donating her only cow to fund a stained glass window, her name etched in the ledger beside nobles and merchants. Cathedral construction sites became the great equalizers of medieval life, where peasants and princes alike could claim ownership in something eternal. The records from Strasbourg tell a revealing story. When funds ran low in the 1300s, the bishop didn't appeal to kings. He turned to the townspeople, offering indulgences, reductions in purgatory time for every day of labor or cartload of sandstone. Soon, butchers formed hauling teams, weavers spun ropes for scaffolding, and children gathered flint chips to mix into mortar. At York Minster, archaeologists found fingerprints pressed into medieval bricks, likely from local women who shaped the clay between childcare and chores. These weren't professional builders, they were ordinary people leaving silent signatures in the walls. Guilds played a starring role, transforming competition into collaboration. In Florence, the Wool Merchants Guild funded Santa Maria del Fiore's dome, while the silk traders sponsored its bronze doors, each group vying to outdo the other in pious generosity. The system was ingeniously reciprocal. A mason might carve his guild's emblem discreetly into a capital, ensuring future members would recognize their legacy. At Canterbury, the Bakers' Guild paid for an oven to feed workers, and in return, their patron saint, Saint Honorius, got prime placement in a chapel window. But the most profound contributions were often the most personal. In Lincoln Cathedral's archives, there's an account of a blind rope maker who twisted hemp cords for the bell tower until his hands bled, believing his labor would earn him a glimpse of heaven. At Chartres, villagers unable to donate money brought sacks of eggs, thousands beaten into mortar to strengthen the walls. Even setbacks became communal rituals. When Rouen Cathedral's tower burned in 1284, citizens formed bucket brigades not to save the structure, it was already lost, but to salvage molten lead from the roof, which they later recast into new gutters. This collective effort forged bonds that transcended class. The same feudal lord who taxed peasants mercilessly might share bread with them on the scaffolding, both sweating under the same summer sun. For illiterate laborers, the cathedral became their living manuscript, a place where they could point to a specific boss stone or floor tile and say, "My grandfather laid that." The slow progress spanning lifetimes turned construction into an intergenerational relay. A blacksmith might shoe the oxen dragging stones, his son would forge the hinges for the doors, his grandson craft the choir screen. Each generation inherited not just the work but the story. What emerges from these fragments is a radical idea. Cathedrals weren't built by the Middle Ages, they built the Middle Ages. The shared purpose of raising these spires helped dissolve old tribal divisions, creating something unprecedented, a sense of civic identity. When the Belfry of Bruges was completed after 80 years, the whole city celebrated not just the tower, but themselves. They hadn't just constructed a building, they'd constructed a community, one stone, one generation, one act of stubborn faith at a time. The stone that built Europe's cathedrals wasn't just material, it was destiny. Every quarry pit and riverbed dictated what was possible, turning geology into theology. Take the honey-colored limestone of Keene in Normandy, soft enough to carve intricate details when first extracted but hardening over time like faith itself. This stone became the gold standard for Gothic cathedrals, shipped as far as Canterbury and London. But not every town was so lucky. Builders in Lincoln had to make do with brittle oolitic limestone that fractured unpredictably, forcing masons to adapt their designs around the rock's stubborn personality. You can still see the evidence today: pillars patched with mismatched stone where blocks split under stress, turning structural fixes into visible scars of perseverance. Winter was the silent architect no blueprint could defy. In the Alps, cathedral projects hibernated for months as freezing temperatures turned mortar to useless slurry. The ledgers of Ulm Minster record years where work stopped entirely because snow blocked mountain passes, stranding shipments of Swabian sandstone. Even in milder regions, frost could be catastrophic. When the unusually harsh winter of 1362 froze the Seine solid, the half-built vaults of Paris's Sainte-Chapelle developed cracks that took a decade to repair. Builders learned to time their projects like farmers planting crops, laying foundations in spring, raising walls through summer, and capping vaults before autumn rains returned. Then there were the battles against invisible enemies. The marshy ground beneath Beauvais Cathedral became its Achilles heel, causing the choir collapse of 1284. Engineers responded by digging pits filled with loose rubble beneath the new foundations, a medieval version of shock absorbers that allowed the earth to shift without fracturing the masonry. Similar ingenuity appeared at Winchester, where the entire cathedral was essentially built on a floating raft of oak logs driven into waterlogged soil. When 13th century builders noticed the structure slowly sinking, they enlisted monks to wade through waist-deep water beneath the nave, reinforcing the submerged supports by candlelight, a 30-year ordeal that turned maintenance into monastic devotion. The elements left their signatures everywhere. At Exeter Cathedral, the west front statues are carved from beer stone, a material so delicate that 5 centuries of rain have melted their features into ghostly silhouettes, a haunting reminder of nature's power over human artistry. Meanwhile, York Minster's masons intentionally used magnesium limestone for gargoyles, knowing its coarse texture would weather dramatically, making the grotesques appear to twist and grimace more fiercely with each passing storm. These weren't failures of planning but acts of collaboration, a dialogue between builders and their environment where compromise often birthed innovation. Perhaps no challenge was more humbling than simple exhaustion of resources. The quarry at Tadcaster that supplied York Minster was literally worked to death, its best seams depleted by the 1400s. Builders resorted to raising Roman ruins for reusable stone, which is why York's foundations contain fragments of pagan temples. At Chartres, the famous blue stained glass owes its survival to an accident of scarcity. When later generations ran low on cobalt, they couldn't replace the windows, preserving medieval glass that would have otherwise been swapped for modern imitations. Even the forests paid a price. The oak beams supporting Ely Cathedral's octagonal tower came from trees that had grown since the time of Charlemagne. Ancient giants felled to hold up human aspirations. What emerges from these struggles is a profound truth. Cathedrals weren't triumphs over nature, but partnerships with it. The veins in marble became part of the design. The weaknesses in sandstone inspired new forms, and the very faults in the earth beneath taught builders humility. When the master mason at Wells Cathedral carved foliage capitals, he didn't fight the natural cracks in the stone. He turned them into stems and vines, making the rock's imperfections part of its beauty. In an age before bulldozers and steel beams, these structures had to grow from their landscapes like trees, their roots sunk deep in local clay and limestone. The result wasn't just architecture shaped by environment, but theology written in the language of the earth itself, a reminder that heaven was always reached through the materials at hand. Every cathedral had its celestial guardian, a patron saint whose stories shaped the very stones around them. These weren't just names etched above doorways. They were living presences, their legends carved into capitals, glowing in stained glass, even dictating the alignment of altars. At Chartres, the Virgin Mary wasn't merely honored, she was architect. The cathedral's labyrinth mirrors medieval maps of her mythical journey to Jerusalem, while its famed blue virgin window bathes the nave in otherworldly sapphire light, a hue said to mimic her heavenly robes. This wasn't decoration, it was devotion made visible. Saints became the spiritual scaffolding of these buildings. Canterbury Cathedral's entire east end stretches unnaturally long, not for aesthetic balance, but to accommodate the shrine of Thomas Beckett, whose murder on its steps turned the site into a pilgrimage magnet. The limestone where he fell was eventually chipped away by devotees, leaving a depression now marked by a striking modern altar. Meanwhile, Santiago de Compostela's very lay outforces pilgrims to circle the Apostle James's relics like planets orbiting a sun, their physical path mirroring the spiritual journey. The stories of these saints didn't just adorn the walls, they animated them. In Cologne Cathedral, the Three Kings Golden Reliquary sits precisely where the rising sun on Epiphany strikes the altar, creating a celestial spotlight effect. At Saint Denis near Paris, the abbey's namesake saint, a decapitated martyr, is depicted repeatedly holding his own head, a motif that inspired the unique double choir design where two altars face each other, symbolizing his body and severed head in eternal dialogue. Even the Gargoyles got in on the act. Notre Dame's famous chimeras include a statue of Saint Denis calmly carrying his head, a darkly comic nod to local lore. But patron saints were more than spiritual figureheads, they were civic lifelines. When Rouen Cathedral burned in 1200, its citizens didn't panic about the loss of their building. They rushed to save the relics of Saint Romain, believing their city's survival depended on his bones. Similarly, when Salisbury's spire began leaning dangerously, locals attributed its stubborn refusal to fall to the intercession of Saint Osmond, whose tomb lay directly beneath. The relationship went both ways. Just as saints protected cathedrals, cathedrals amplified saints' fame. Before Saint Hugh became Lincoln's beloved patron, he was an obscure French bishop, until his miracles at the cathedral construction site, like the legendary beam that floated into place when workers couldn't lift it, cemented his status. The most fascinating evidence lies in the details only medieval eyes would catch. The 24 elders carved around Amiens's choir each hold instruments except one, who clutches a model of the cathedral itself. This subtle nod to Saint Firmin, the city's first bishop, tied the building's present to its apostolic past. At Wells Cathedral, the scissor arches added to stabilize the tower weren't just engineering fixes. Their form echoes the saltire cross on St. Andrew's banner, honoring the cathedral's dedication to Christ's first disciple. Even the floors whispered these connections. Winchester's great screen originally had statues of saints aligned so their shadows would touch worshippers during specific feast days, a fleeting moment of holy contact. What emerges is a sacred feedback loop. Saints gave cathedrals their spiritual DNA, while cathedrals gave saints their cultural immortality. The very stones became theological time capsules, like Durham Cathedral's Galilee Chapel, where columns are carved with spiral patterns mimicking the rope St. Cuthbert used to gird his habit, a detail only Benedictine monks would recognize. These weren't inside jokes but layered narratives, ensuring every generation from illiterate peasants to learned clerics could find meaning at their own level. When a pilgrim traced their finger along the worn grooves of St. James's scallop shell carved into Santiago's walls, they weren't just touching stone. They were touching a story that had outlived empires, a testament to the enduring power of belief etched into limestone and memory alike. Walk into any Gothic cathedral, and you immediately sense the rhythm of worship in its bones. The soaring nave isn't just grand, it's precisely calibrated to carry chant and organ music to the farthest pew. The choir stalls sit elevated not for better views, but because their polyphonic harmonies were believed to ascend like incense toward heaven. Even the pillars' spacing follows a sacred mathematics. At Rheims Cathedral, the distance between columns matches the time it takes to process from one to the next while singing a verse of Gregorian chant. This wasn't architecture for show. It was a machine meticulously engineered for the soul's transformation. Take the altar's placement always at the east end, not by tradition alone, but as a daily reenactment of Christ's resurrection. At dawn on Easter, sunlight would pierce through strategically aligned clerestory windows, igniting the golden retable in a burst of light timed to the Gloria of the Mass. Meanwhile, the ambulatory that curved hallway behind the altar solved a logistical miracle. Pilgrims could venerate relics in perpetual motion, circling the sacred space like planets in orbit without interrupting the clergy's rituals. Durham Cathedral perfected this dance. Its ribbed vaults over the ambulatory are slightly lower, creating acoustic dampening that muffled pilgrims' footsteps during services above. Every niche had dual purpose. Those side chapels lining the nave weren't just decorative. They functioned as spiritual pit stops where multiple priests could simultaneously say private masses, a necessity when the church required daily celebration. The triforium, that narrow gallery above the arches, wasn't merely aesthetic. It housed additional worshippers during feast days and provided ventilation to prevent candle smoke from choking the congregation below. Even the floor played its part. The uneven paving stones in Canterbury's choir weren't shoddy workmanship. They discouraged rushing, forcing clergy to move with deliberate reverence during ceremonies. The most ingenious solutions emerged from constraint. When Salisbury Cathedral's builders realized their thin Purbeck marble shafts couldn't support traditional vaulting, they invented the double arcade, stacking 2 layers of arches to distribute weight while creating ethereal vertical lines. At Lincoln, the infamous crazy vaults twist and swirl not just for drama, but to accommodate the irregular spacing of windows needed for liturgical processions. These weren't compromises, they were acts of devotion, bending physics to serve prayer. Perhaps no feature better marries function and faith than the rood screen. This ornate partition separating nave from choir served as both stage and theological diagram. During Lent, curtains would veil its sculptures, enacting Christ's withdrawal into the wilderness. On Palm Sunday, clergy hidden atop it would sing the Gloria Laus, as if from heaven itself, while congregants below waved branches in response. The screen's very structure taught hierarchy, lay people in the nave, clergy in the choir, the crucified Christ above all, yet its pierced tracery ensured no one was fully excluded from glimpsing the mysteries beyond. These cathedrals didn't just host worship, they choreographed it, turning movement, light, and sound into sacraments. A priest raising the Eucharist at the exact moment sunlight struck the altar wasn't coincidence. It was architecture conspiring with liturgy to make the divine tangible. Every measurement, every curve, every shaft of light was a silent participant in the Mass, proving that sacred space wasn't where worship happened, but how it breathed. Cathedrals weren't frozen in time, they were living chronicles, their stones whispering the artistic revolutions of generations. Start at the base of Strasbourg Cathedral, and you'll feel the shift beneath your fingertips. The lower levels are heavy, rounded Romanesque arches, squat and muscular like a fortress, while above them, the Gothic spires explode skyward in a riot of delicate tracery. This wasn't a contradiction, it was evolution in action. Builders didn't scrap the old to make way for the new. They layered innovations like pages in a manuscript, each era leaving its signature. Romanesque architecture, with its barrel vaults and thick walls, dominated the 11th century. Churches like Durham Cathedral in England were built like spiritual bunkers, their small windows casting dim, mystical light perfect for contemplative monastic life. But as the 12th century dawned, a radical idea took hold. What if holiness could be felt through height and light? The Gothic revolution began. Subtly pointed arches first appeared not as aesthetic choices but as engineering solutions, distributing weight more efficiently than rounded Romanesque ones. Then came the ribbed vault, allowing ceilings to soar higher without collapsing under their own mass. By the time builders at St. Denis Abbey near Paris fused these elements in the 1140s, the effect was electrifying. Walls dissolved into stained glass, and the very air seemed to vibrate with colored light. Yet the transition was rarely clean. At Chartres, the west facade's sturdy Romanesque towers, one plane, one intricately carved, stand awkwardly beside the nave's flamboyant Gothic arches, a testament to the 50-year gap between their construction. Canterbury Cathedral's crypt remains stubbornly Romanesque even as the choir above it leaps into Gothic verticality, creating a visual timeline of theological shifts, from God as stern judge to divine light. Some adaptations were pragmatic. When Lincoln Cathedral's central tower collapsed in 1239, rebuilders didn't just repair it, they reimagined it with the latest Gothic buttresses, turning disaster into a showcase for cutting-edge design. Then came the Renaissance with its love of symmetry and classical ideals. In Florence, Brunelleschi's dome for Santa Maria del Fiore rejected Gothic complexity for clean geometric harmony, while in England, retrofits like the fan vaulting at Gloucester Abbey married medieval structure with Renaissance ornament. The most fascinating hybrids emerged where styles collided by necessity. Seville Cathedral's Gothic bones were literally built around the city's former mosque, its minaret repurposed as a bell tower with Renaissance additions stacked like layers on a cake. Even the gargoyles got makeovers. Those at Milan Cathedral began as Gothic grotesques but were later joined by Renaissance cherubs, creating a stone menagerie where snarling demons coexisted with chubby angels. These stylistic collisions weren't accidents, they were conversations across time. When Baroque architects added swirling altarpieces to Gothic naves, they weren't defacing the past, they were dialoguing with it, letting each generation reinterpret the sacred. That's why restoration purists today face a dilemma. Is a cathedral most authentic when preserved as first built, or as a living record of continual reinvention? The answer lies in the stones themselves, where every patchwork pillar and repurposed capital whispers the same truth, that faith isn't static, and neither are the monuments we raise to honor it. Cathedrals didn't just reach for the heavens, they expanded minds. Beneath those vaulted ceilings, amid the scent of incense and wax, thrived some of the most vibrant centers of learning in medieval Europe. While we marvel at their spires today, their true legacy might lie in the quiet corners where scholars hunched over manuscripts, where choir masters pioneered musical notation, and where the seeds of universities first took root. Take Chartres Cathedral's famous school, where the philosopher John of Salisbury studied in the 1200s. Its library held treasures like Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, copied painstakingly by monks' texts that bridged ancient thought and medieval scholarship. This wasn't just a place to train priests, it was a crucible where logic, astronomy, and even early scientific inquiry flourished under the guise of theology. Music found its voice in these stone halls too. The very acoustics that made Gregorian chant resonate also nurtured musical breakthroughs. At Notre Dame in Paris, composers like Léonin and Patron experimented with polyphony, layering melodies in ways that defied tradition. Their Magnus Liber Organi, the Great Book of Organum, revolutionized Western music by allowing multiple voices to intertwine like the cathedral's own ribbed vaults. The innovation wasn't just artistic, it was mathematical. To synchronize singers spaced across the choir, masters developed early forms of musical notation, turning squiggles on parchment into a universal language of sound. The cathedral's role as an intellectual hub extended beyond elites. In Lincoln, the choristers' school taught grammar and arithmetic to local boys, many of whom would never take holy orders. York Minster's library lent books to tradesmen, its margins filled with notes from butchers and bakers wrestling with Latin texts. Even the stained glass served as a classroom. The Poor Men's Bible at Canterbury depicted everything from Genesis to Revelation in glowing panels, offering theological lessons to those who couldn't read. Debates roared as loudly as prayers. Cathedral squares hosted public disputations where scholars grappled with heresies, Aristotelian logic, and the nature of the soul. At Rheims, the theologian Hugh of St. Victor famously defended the idea that all knowledge, even secular, led to God, a radical notion that laid groundwork for Renaissance humanism. These clashes of ideas weren't tidy, they mirrored the cathedral's own architectural experiments, where trial and error produced both brilliance and collapse. What emerged was a paradox. Buildings intended to glorify God became laboratories for human intellect. The same masons calculating load-bearing walls inspired new geometric thinking. The scribes illuminating Bibles preserved pagan classics alongside scripture. Even the Gargoyles, with their mix of sacred and grotesque, whispered that wisdom could lurk in unexpected places. Long before universities had dedicated campuses, cathedrals were the original multidisciplinary schools, where heaven and earth, faith and reason, stone and thought intertwined. Step into any medieval cathedral, and you're literally walking inside across the floor plan itself, a silent sermon in stone, that long central nave stretching toward the altar. It's the vertical beam of Christ's crucifixion, the shorter arms jutting outward. Those transepts form the crossbar where his hands were nailed. Even the east-facing apse, glowing with morning light, isn't just architectural tradition. It's a deliberate echo of Jerusalem, where the sun rises over Golgotha. This wasn't subtle symbolism, it was theology carved into the very ground believers walked on. The genius lay in how this design shaped movement and meaning. Pilgrims entering the west door would process down the nave, literally walking the path of Christ's suffering, before reaching the crossing where transepts and nave intersect. This sacred junction wasn't just structural, it marked the spiritual pivot from death to resurrection. At Wells Cathedral, the pavement here inlays a cosmic diagram showing Christ at the center of time and space, while the vault overhead blossoms into a starry canopy, completing the 3D metaphor, humanity's earthly journey meeting divine eternity. Even the proportions whispered secrets. Many cathedrals used the golden ratio in their cruciform plans, a mathematical harmony believed to reflect God's perfect order. The transepts at Amiens are precisely half the length of the nave, mirroring the biblical 3 days between crucifixion and resurrection, a hidden numerical sermon. Meanwhile, the slight asymmetry in some plans, like Lincoln's north transept being wider than the south, wasn't poor drafting. It represented the wound in Christ's side, a deliberate imperfection sanctified by sacrifice. The cross shape also choreographed communal worship. When congregations gathered for major feasts, the faithful would pack the nave, clergy fill the choir, and bishops preside from the apse, each group positioned like living stations of the cross. During Lent, processions would wind from the darkest western end, symbolizing sin, toward the radiant east, resurrection, physically enacting redemption. At Cluny Abbey, monks even timed their chants so the final Amen would coincide with reaching the crossing, turning architecture into liturgy. But the most profound symbolism might be what's unseen. Beneath many cathedrals, crypts house the bones of martyrs, literal foundations of faith supporting the cross above. At Saint Denis near Paris, the abbey's namesake saint was buried directly beneath the crossing, his relics forming the keystone of both structure and symbolism. This vertical axis, crypt below, altar at heart, spire above, transformed the building into a ladder between earth and heaven, with the cruciform floor as its map. The enduring power of this design lies in its simplicity. A peasant who'd never opened a Bible could grasp the cathedral's message just by standing in its shadow. The cross was their compass, the transepts their outstretched arms in prayer, the nave their lifelong journey toward grace. Even today, when secular visitors sketch the floor plan, they're unconsciously tracing Christianity's central paradox, that death and glory, suffering and triumph, could coexist in a single sacred shape. Cathedral construction sites didn't just transform skylines, they jump-started entire economies. Picture a sleepy 11th century village suddenly overrun with stonecutters dragging sledges of limestone, carpenters shaping oak into scaffolding, and glassmakers bartering for chunks of cobalt and gold. Overnight, these projects became medieval versions of boom towns, with demand for everything from nails to ale sending ripples through regional trade networks. Records from Canterbury show the cathedral's workforce consumed 12,000 loaves of bread and 900 gallons of beer in a single year, enough to keep local bakers and brewers thriving for decades. But the real economic magic happened beyond the construction fence. Enterprising locals set up markets along pilgrimage routes, selling everything from leaded glass to commemorative badges. In Chartres, the cathedral's Marian cult turned the town into a medieval tourist trap, with innkeepers charging premium rates for rooms during feast days. At Santiago de Compostela, a whole industry sprouted around scallop shells. Pilgrims favored souvenirs harvested from nearby beaches and carved with saintly images. Even the cathedral's waste-fueled commerce. Masons' chipped flints were repurposed by farmers to strengthen field walls, while leftover mortar found its way into peasant homes as makeshift plaster. The workforce itself became a microeconomy. Skilled masons commanded wages comparable to knights, their pay often including food, lodging, and even lifetime pensions. Laborers formed early unions like the Strasbourg Lodge that negotiated winter stipends for its members, setting precedents for workers' rights. Women found unexpected opportunities too, running alehouses for thirsty crews or taking over husbands' masonry contracts when they fell ill. The York Minster rolls list a widow named Agnes who supplied nails for 30 years after her blacksmith husband's death, proving these projects could be social levelers as much as spiritual ones. Long after the last stone was laid, cathedrals kept generating wealth. The relic trade turned towns like Conques into medieval equivalents of Silicon Valley startups. Its golden statue of Saint Foy attracting so many pilgrims, the village grew tenfold in a century. Tax records from Lincoln reveal cathedral clerics were the city's top lenders, financing everything from wool exports to bridge repairs. And let's not forget the artisans. Stained glass workshops in Rouen supplied windows for churches across Europe, while the marble carvers of Purbeck turned their local stone into a medieval brand name, shipping polished columns as far as Norway. The ultimate proof lies in urban footprints. Cities that bet big on cathedrals, Siena, Reims, Cologne, outpaced rivals to become commercial powerhouses. Their success wasn't just divine favor, it was smart economics. By concentrating skilled labor, attracting pious tourists, and circulating wealth through guilds, these stone giants acted like medieval stimulus packages. The next time you admire a cathedral spire, remember, it wasn't just reaching for heaven, it was lifting entire communities up with it. Behind every soaring cathedral spire, there were hands that history often forgot, the hands of women. While medieval chronicles loved to credit bishops and master masons, the truth is these stone marvels owe just as much to noble women who funded their construction, widows who donated their life savings, and craftswomen who shaped glass and stone alongside men. Take Elena of Aquitaine, who not only bankrolled portions of Poitiers Cathedral, but insisted its windows depict biblical heroines like Deborah and Judith, carving feminine wisdom into the sacred narrative. Or the lesser-known but equally remarkable Hawise of Chester, who in 1252 personally financed the rebuilding of Lincoln Cathedral's collapsed tower, her name etched into the ledger alongside kings and archbishops. The workshop floors tell another hidden story. Guild records from York reveal women like Agnes the Glazier, who apprenticed under her father and later led a team crafting stained glass for the minster's east window. At Chartres, archaeologists found mortar mixed with egg whites, a technique local nuns reportedly perfected to strengthen the cathedral's foundations during winter months when traditional mixtures failed. These weren't exceptions, they were threads in a larger tapestry. In Cologne, the stonemasons' lodge employed widows to polish marble columns, their delicate touch believed to bring out the stone's inner glow. Even the humblest contributions carried weight. Peasant women across Europe formed stone-carrying guilds, hauling rubble from quarries in exchange for indulgences, their labor literally baked into cathedral walls. The most enduring marks, though, lie in the art itself. Walk through Canterbury Cathedral's crypt, and you'll find a small but exquisite chapel dedicated to Saint Anne, commissioned by Queen Berengaria in 1220. Its walls shimmer with scenes of women from Scripture, not as passive figures but as active participants in sacred history. Similar surprises hide in plain sight. The famous Belle Verrière window at Chartres, long attributed to anonymous masters, bears the faint outline of a woman's hand in its lower corner, likely the signature of a glass painter whose name was lost but whose artistry still dazzles 8 centuries later. These contributions didn't just challenge the era's gender norms, they reshaped cathedral culture. When Margaret of Flanders donated her entire dowry to Amiens Cathedral in 1280, she demanded, and received, a say in its design, resulting in the unusual inclusion of a maternity ward within the cloisters. At Salisbury, the Countess of Salisbury's patronage funded a library with books specifically for female devotees, a radical concept in an age when most women were barred from theological study. Even in death, women left their mark. The tomb of Lady Clare at Tewkesbury Abbey doubles as a structural pillar, her effigy literally supporting the vaults above, a silent rebuttal to anyone who assumed these buildings rested solely on male shoulders. What emerges from these fragments is a truth as sturdy as the cathedrals themselves. These monuments were always collaborative tapestries, woven with threads of devotion from every corner of society. The next time you gaze up at a rose window, remember it might have been funded by a queen's ransom or glazed by a craftswoman working under the flicker of her own lantern. Their light, like the stained glass they helped create, still shines through. Imagine the Burj Khalifa, today's tallest skyscraper, rising in just 6 years, while Notre Dame took nearly 200. This staggering gap isn't just about technological advancement. It's a window into two entirely different worlds of intention. Modern construction thrives on efficiency, with cranes and prefabricated materials slicing through timelines. But medieval cathedrals embraced a radical patience, where the journey of building mattered as much as the finished spire. Workers knew their grandchildren's grandchildren might be the ones to lay the final stone, yet they carved each block with the same devotion as if it were the capstone. Consider the materials. Today's glass and steel towers prioritize lightweight strength and quick assembly, designed to weather decades, not centuries. But the limestone of Chartres or the oak beams of Westminster Hall were chosen precisely because they aged beautifully, gaining character as they weathered. Modern engineers calculate load-bearing capacities to the millimeter. Medieval masons embedded symbolic strength, pillars thick enough to represent steadfast faith, vaults high enough to evoke heaven's reach. Even the imperfections were intentional. The slight lean of Pisa's campanile would horrify a contemporary architect, but to medieval eyes it whispered a humbling truth. Human efforts, no matter how grand, still bowed to natural forces. The financing tells its own tale. Where skyscraper projects secure billion-dollar loans before breaking ground, cathedrals often survived on piecemeal donations. A widow's coins, a merchant's seasonal pledge, even a king's deathbed bequest. This patchwork funding meant construction could stall for decades, yet it also wove the community into the building's DNA. Today's buildings rise on spreadsheets. Cathedrals grew through collective sacrifice, their delays becoming part of their story. Most striking is the contrast in labor. Modern sites rely on specialized crews working in shifts, their names rarely etched into the structure. But cathedral stones bear the actual chisel marks of individual masons' signatures, like Thomas the Carver's distinctive leaf motif at York Minster, or the hidden faces laborers smuggled into bosses as inside jokes. Speed wasn't just unnecessary, it was suspect. A stained glass artisan might spend a year on a single window, believing haste compromised spiritual integrity. Yet for all their differences, these approaches share a common thread. Both eras build to proclaim their values. Our glass towers celebrate human ingenuity and economic might. Their stone spires whispered of eternity. Perhaps the real lesson lies in the middle ground. What if our next great project married modern efficiency with medieval intentionality? Imagine a skyscraper designed to weather 500 years, its materials aging gracefully, its corners carved with the names of those who raised it. The cathedrals challenge us to ask not just how fast we can build, but what we're building toward. Fire didn't just scar these cathedrals, it reforged them. When flames consumed Canterbury Cathedral's choir in 1174, the disaster became an opportunity. Rather than simply restoring the Romanesque ruins, builders seized the moment to introduce revolutionary Gothic arches, England's first, transforming tragedy into a turning point for architectural history. This pattern repeated across Europe. Rowan's spire collapsed in 1512, only to be rebuilt with intricate lace-like stonework that made it the tallest in France. Even the Great Fire of London in 1666, which spared Westminster Abbey's structure but gutted its interior, led to Christopher Wren's stunning fan vaults, disaster birthing beauty. Riots and revolts left different scars. During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, mobs stormed London's churches, smashing stained glass they saw as symbols of clerical excess. Yet within decades, those very windows were replaced with even more elaborate scenes, not to glorify the powerful, but to reclaim sacred space for communal hope. In Prague, Hussite rebels defenestrated city officials from the cathedral towers in 1419, yet the bloodshed ultimately inspired the breathtaking Golden Window, where sunlight filters through bullet holes patched with molten gold, a literal alchemy of violence into light. Neglect could be just as devastating as fire or fury. Durham Cathedral's once vibrant frescoes faded under centuries of candle soot, their biblical stories nearly erased. But when 19th century restorers uncovered the ghostly outlines, they didn't repaint them, they preserved the faint traces as a testament to endurance. Similarly, the Black Death's devastation halted construction on countless sites, leaving half-built towers like skeletal hands reaching skyward. But when work resumed, the surviving craftsmen incorporated memorials into the stone, tiny carved rats hidden among foliage, or sorrowing angels holding empty scrolls, turning grief into artistry. What's miraculous isn't that these buildings survived, but how each crisis became a catalyst. Cologne Cathedral stood incomplete for 300 years, its crane rusting in place as wars and famines drained coffers. Yet when Prussia finally funded its completion in 1880, the renewed effort united Protestants and Catholics alike, a secular nation finishing what the medieval church began. Even natural disasters played their part. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 shattered the city's cathedral, but the rebuilt version incorporated seismic innovations that later saved thousands during future quakes. These resurrections reveal a profound truth. Cathedrals weren't fragile relics, but living entities that adapted like organisms. Every scorch mark on the stones of York Minster from the 1644 siege, every patched bullet hole in Rheims' facade from World War I, became part of the narrative, not scars to hide, but badges of survival. When Notre Dame's spire collapsed in 2019, the global outpouring of grief and donations proved these stones still pulse with meaning, because a cathedral isn't just a building. It's a promise whispered across centuries that what rises from ashes can shine brighter than what was lost. The soaring spire of Cologne Cathedral wasn't completed until 1880, 6 centuries after its foundation stone was laid. For generations, its stump of a tower stood capped by a rusty medieval crane, a skeletal silhouette against the skyline that locals called the cathedral's hat. This unfinished giant wasn't an exception. It was part of a hidden tradition of incomplete masterpieces that whisper a surprising truth about medieval ambition. Some cathedrals, like Narbonne's in France, never progressed beyond their choir, their naves left as open-air courtyards where wind whistled through half-built arches. Others, like Santiago de Compostella's original west facade, were concealed for centuries behind makeshift Baroque facades, like a Gothic heart beating beneath borrowed clothes. These fragments tell richer stories than many finished buildings. Take Beauvais Cathedral, where the world's highest Gothic choir stands abruptly severed, its intended nave never materializing after two catastrophic collapses. What might seem like failure is actually a frozen moment of audacity, a 14th century skyscraper pushing engineering to its breaking point. The stumps of abandoned buttresses still jutting from its sides aren't scars, they're invitations to imagine what might have been. Similarly, the mismatched towers of Chartres, one plain Romanesque, one flamboyant Gothic art aesthetic flaws but a timeline in stone, documenting how tastes and technologies evolved across the 100-year gap between their constructions. The financial records reveal why so many projects stalled. At Regensburg in Germany, construction halted when the bishop diverted funds to ransom himself from pirates. In Segovia, the cathedral's original site was abandoned mid-construction because the townspeople revolted against the clergy's tax demands, forcing builders to start anew across town. These interruptions weren't always tragedies, they often birthed innovation. When Seville's cathedral incorporated the minaret of the mosque it replaced, the hybrid structure became a powerful symbol of cultural continuity. Perhaps the most poignant unfinished feature isn't missing towers but absent people. The empty statue niches on Freiburg Minster's facade weren't left bare from lack of skill. They awaited donors who never came. The uncarved blocks at the base of Ulm's spire weren't oversights. They marked where 14th century masons downed tools when the Black Death emptied their ranks. These gaps speak louder than any completed element, reminding us that cathedrals weren't just expressions of faith, but of fragile human communities weathering famine, plague, and war. Yet there's profound beauty in this incompleteness. Like a musical score with missing measures, these buildings invite us to participate in their creation. The unfilled tracery at Barcelona's Sagrada Familia, itself a modern echo of medieval protracted construction, allows us to witness the stonecarver's art unfolding in real time. When Lincoln Cathedral's original spire blew down in 1549 and was never replaced, the resulting silhouette became more distinctive than any planned design. These unfinished symphonies challenge our obsession with completion, suggesting that perfection lies not in finality, but in the courage to begin something grander than one lifetime can encompass. The stones whisper what medieval builders knew, that reaching beyond our grasp is its own form of prayer. Cathedrals haunt our modern imagination like limestone ghosts, their silhouettes flickering through films, novels, and video games as shorthand for the sublime. Think of Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, where Quasimodo's bell tower became a character itself, or the shadowy cloisters of the Name of the Rose, where Umberto Eco turned a Benedictine abbey into a labyrinth of medieval intrigue. These structures transcend their brick-and-mortar reality to become stages for our deepest stories, their vaulted aisles echoing with everything from superhero battles to vampire lore. When Gotham City's architects needed a visual metaphor for Batman's tortured nobility, they reached for Gothic spires. When Assassin's Creed wanted players to feel the dizzying scale of the Renaissance, it sent them scrambling up the Duomo's dome. What makes them such irresistible backdrops? Partly, it's their layered history. Every weathered gargoyle seems to guard untold secrets. The Winchester Mystery House, with its staircases to nowhere, taps into the same eerie fascination that draws crowds to Glastonbury Abbey's rumored Arthurian connections. Modern storytellers amplify this aura, like pillars of the earth weaving cathedral construction into a saga of ambition and betrayal, or the Hunchback of Notre Dame musical transforming stone into a chorus of judgmental saints. Even dystopian tales lean on their ruins. The Handmaid's Tale films in Cambridge's chapels to underscore the weight of twisted dogma. Yet cathedrals don't just frame fiction, they shape how we envision human potential. The immersive VR reconstruction of Notre Dame post-fire didn't just preserve architecture, it let users inhabit the medieval mind, experiencing the space as artisans once did. Artists like Hiroshi Sugimoto photographed cathedral interiors with exposures so long, the stones seem to breathe, while composer Avo Pet's Spiegel im Spiegel mimics the way light filters through clerestory windows note by luminous note. Their appeal lies in paradox. They're both timeless and urgently relevant. A climate activist projecting melting glaciers onto Milan Cathedral's facade, or Banksy smuggling drone graffiti into Westminster Abbey, proves these spaces still provoke. Pilgrims now arrive with smartphones instead of staffs, yet the impulse remains to marvel, to question, to touch something older than nations. When a jazz ensemble improvises under Chartres acoustics or a silent disco pulses in York Minster's nave, it's not sacrilege but reinvention. Cathedrals endure because they're not relics, they're mirrors reflecting whatever era stands before them. The next time you see a cathedral silhouette in a movie's establishing shot, listen closer. Those stones aren't just set dressing, they're whispering 8 centuries of human audacity, inviting us to add our verse to their unfinished symphony. Medieval cathedrals stand as silent witnesses to a radical idea that the most extraordinary human achievements aren't solo acts, but symphonies played across generations. These stone marvels challenge our modern obsession with speed and instant gratification, offering instead a masterclass in delayed glory. Consider the anonymous mason who carved a perfect capital in 1280, knowing he'd never see the vault it would support a century later. Or the peasant woman who donated her only silver coin to fund a stained glass window, trusting that her great-grandchildren might one day bask in its colored light. This wasn't just construction, it was an act of faith in the unseen, a bridge between the present and the future. What makes these buildings truly timeless isn't their height or artistry, but the profound conversations they spark across centuries. A 14th century pilgrim gazing up at Chartres' labyrinth shares the same awe as a modern tourist snapping photos, both confronted with the same unspoken question: what would you sacrifice for something you'll never see completed? In an age where apps promise instant everything, cathedrals whisper a countercultural truth that the best things take not just time but collective perseverance. The cracks in their walls, from Beauvais' collapsed choir to Cologne's 600-year construction, aren't flaws but fingerprints of humanity, reminders that even our grandest dreams are shaped by struggle. These structures also hold up a mirror to our values. When towns diverted famine relief funds to keep cathedral projects alive, or when guilds spent decades perfecting carvings only angels would see clearly, they revealed priorities that might baffle us today. Yet in their stubborn devotion to beauty beyond utility, medieval builders left an unexpected gift: permission to create without immediate purpose. The gargoyles diverting rainwater, the hidden frescoes only visible at certain sun angles, the acoustic tricks amplifying whispered prayers. These weren't practical necessities but love letters to the divine and to the future. As you step away from this journey through stone and stained glass, carry this thought: cathedrals weren't finished when the last stone was laid. Their true completion happens every time someone pauses to trace a mason's mark, deciphers a stained glass parable, or simply catches their breath under vaults that took lifetimes to raise. They remind us that legacy isn't about putting your name on something, it's about adding your voice to a chorus too big for any one lifetime. Whether you're building a family, a community, or simply a meaningful day, the cathedral's lesson endures. Greatness grows slowly, brick by brick, carried forward on the faith that others will continue what we began. If these ancient stones could speak, they might offer the most comforting words of all: that no act of faithful labor, however small, is ever wasted.